Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world today. Welcome to the USAID Asia Counter Trafficking In-Person Summit from Evidence to Action, hosted by Windrock International. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Identifying and Addressing Forced Labor in Supply Chains. We'll begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we just want to cover a few technical features available for you today. We're using Zoom meetings to enable as much interactivity as possible. Therefore, your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many comments and questions as we can throughout today's session. You may also raise your hands later in the session in order to intervene in the discussion if you would like. To help us acknowledge you and your questions and inputs, please rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window. You'll then see a participants list show up on the right where you can hover over your own name, click more, and then click rename. This meeting will be recorded today for your information, and please keep your camera off unless you are invited to speak in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. We're highly encouraging everyone to continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams and spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags #WinrockE2A and #EvidenceToAction. Once again, you're at the session titled Identifying and Addressing Forced Labor in Supply Chains. We'll get started in just a minute here. Thank you for your patience. All right, I believe that we are now ready to get started. Once again, you are at the session titled Identifying and Addressing Forced Labor in Supply Chains. I'm going to hand the floor now to Steve Brunn, Senior Director of Private Sector Partnerships at Windrock International. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hermes. I'm very happy that we have three of the most influential organizations as it relates to human rights and global supply chains with us today. Each brings a very different perspective on this topic, and I'm looking forward to bringing out those perspectives. I think as this audience knows, the awareness of forced labor and supply chains has advanced considerably over the past decade, from a point of denial, maybe 10 plus years ago, to limited acknowledgement among the private sector, to now most companies acknowledging that this is a global issue, exists in almost every country and in almost every supply chain in some way. Yet many are still struggling to determine what actions they can take and how to drive real and measurable impact. That's the focus of the panel today, is how do we actually take those steps? What has been done in the past? What have we learned from that? And what can we do in the future? So in addition to that, this panel is intended to help us understand what are the drivers of research and due diligence? What are some of the initial catalysts for that? How does that research then lead to action? And how do we measure the impact of the action that actually results? And then how does that feed into, again, further research and due diligence to inform future actions? Our panelists today are Declan Croucher, Senior Director, Advisory Services at Verite, Max Butler, the CREST Project Manager at IOM. CREST is Corporate Responsibility in Eliminating Slavery and Trafficking, and CBeatry Restrepo, Senior Manager, Worker Engagement and Programs at Elevate. The format of our panel today, we'll have each panelist briefly describe their organization. I think most of you are probably familiar with each, but just in case, we'll do a quick refresher, a brief introduction to their role, and then where they're calling in from today. Then for the majority of their discussion, they'll be talking about one or more examples of how their organization has helped to identify and address forced labor. After each panelist presents, I and other panelists will ask questions, and the audience, as Hermes said as well, can ask questions as well via the text box or raising your hand. That should still leave us with plenty of time at the end for an open discussion. But again, at any time, feel free to add your questions via chat or raise your hand, and I'll facilitate that conversation. With that, I think we can get started. So we're going to go in the order that I announced the panelists. So starting with Verite, then moving on to IOM, and then Elevate. So to start off with, again, Declan Croucher, Senior Director Advisory Services at Verite.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, good evening to everybody from wherever you're calling. On behalf of Verite, I'd like to thank Winrock International and the organizers of the summit for inviting us to participate in this important event. For those that perhaps are not familiar with Verite, we were founded in 1995 with a vision of a world where people work under safe, fair, and legal conditions. We're a civil society organization. We work globally with governments, multinational companies and their suppliers, unions, nonprofit organizations, labor advocates, and other stakeholders who are interested in mitigating risks to workers in global supply chains. We achieve our mission through the conduct of independent research. We also do focused assessments and investigations. We provide consulting, training. We develop and provide open access to various tools and resources to assist stakeholders address the most egregious human rights and labor issues in global supply chains. My role as Senior Director of Advisory Services is corporate engagement, basically. So I'm involved in a lot of our programs that involve the private sector, and obviously in recent years, the issue of forced labor and supply chains looms large. In that. I'm calling in this evening. It's a little after 9 p.m. from outside Worcester, Massachusetts, on the east coast of the U.S. So when it comes to the issue of forced labor as an institution, we use the ILO, the International Labor Organization, indicators in all of our independent research on forced labor across sectors, countries, as well as more broadly in our work with individual companies in their discrete supply chains. We find that the ILO indicators, provide an internationally accepted, sort of credible set of components of forced labor vulnerability that allow us to analyze both the presence of forced labor risk as well as the identification of forced labor itself in supply chains. By doing that, it allows us to position our research in such a way that it points towards clear and specific interventions that can address discrete aspects of forced labor risk. So, for example, the recruitment debt associated with fees and costs borne by workers, or passport retention, or obstacles to workers, terminating their contract early in accordance with applicable national law. One of the reports that most people are probably familiar with is our 2014 research into the electronics sector in Malaysia. This was funded by the United States Department of Labor, and that funding enabled us to further develop our analytical approach by not just identifying forced labor vulnerability, but also diagnosing specific cases. It was the first time that we had done it against the ILO analytical framework. That particular research people may be familiar with, use a mixed quantitative, qualitative methodology to gather information from approximately 500 workers. Survey questions were specifically designed to gather information from individual workers about each of the forced labor indicators we were studying, and then the presence and incidence of forced labor in each particular respondent.
Declan, sorry, you might have been muted.
Was I muted from the very beginning?
No, you're good.
Just about 10, 20 seconds.
Oh, but okay, because I didn't touch
Yeah.
anything. Sorry. I don't know how, well, I don't think I did. My apologies. So let me back up. Did you catch my introduction to the research into the Malaysia electronic sector?
Yep, and you were talking about surveys on forced labor indicators, and I think right about there is when we dropped off.
Okay, so we interviewed approximately 500 workers across a variety of different nationalities, locations, tiers of the particular supply chains, spread across various different work sites. Each interview then focused on the forced labor indicators we were studying, and the presence and incidence of forced labor then for each respondent was determined against the ILO analytical framework. So that's a sort of a brief overview of the kind of the methodology. The overall results of the research, 32% or almost 1 in 3 of the foreign workers in the Malaysian sector that were surveyed as part of this survey were found to be in a condition of forced labor. If we added in those at an elevated risk or on the cusp or threshold, that number rose to about 75%. Some of the key findings beneath that high level conclusion, 92% of workers had paid recruitment fees in order to get their job. Overwhelming majority had borrowed in order to pay those fees. 94% of workers did not hold their own passports. Almost half of the workers had experienced some form of restriction on their freedom of movement, and in excess of half of them, were unable to resign voluntarily in accordance with applicable law. I do want to point out, it's not that these issues were unknown prior to that report, but I think because of its particular methodological rigor and frankly interest in the sector, it did contribute to significant changes on the part of many stakeholders, governments, industry bodies, and indeed individual companies too, within the sector and beyond, to be fair. And I think it helped clarify the agenda for action, which, frankly continues today on issues like recruitment fees paid by workers, recruitment-borne debt, passports, ethical or responsible recruitment, as well as restriction on freedom of movement. I believe most people on the call right now probably know this, but I do want to emphasize these issues, nor the continued action, are in any way, shape, or form confined to the electronic sector, nor Malaysia for that matter. These issues are pervasive. They're global, in supply chains. We continue to use the indicators in our research work. We're using them right now on additional independent research, some of which is also funded by U.S. Department of Labor, as well as other entities, as well as our work in specific supply chains. To sort of wrap up, the solutions that we frequently recommend to take aim at some of the root causes of the indicators, that we identify, include, if we're talking, for example, about recruitment-borne debt, in virtually every case of forced labor that we encounter, what we find at the root of that issue is, an employer that did not actually pay the full and true costs of ethical recruitment in accordance with international standards. And of course, those costs then are passed on and bloated, passed on to workers by unscrupulous agents and other intermediaries. So, the solutions we recommend, in addition to ensuring, that there's full reimbursement of those fees, it's an important remedy as well as deterrent, but it's also important to ensure that any sustained solution ensures that those employers are paying the full and true costs of ethical recruitment, that they're holding their recruitment agents and intermediaries, accountable for ethical and legal conduct. Otherwise, frankly, workers will continue to pay, they will continue to get into debt, and these issues will be with us, unfortunately, for some time to come. So I'll pause there, and apologies for the muting in the middle of that. So back to you, Steve.
Great, thank you, Declan. A couple of questions that came up for me as you were going through kind of how this develops and the findings and the outcomes and how it translated into results. You mentioned that there had been research that had been performed before. So I'm wondering, do you know what some of the gaps were in that research in this sector, or what were some of the catalysts that I don't know if the DOL specifically say, we want to look at forced labor risks in the electronic sector in Malaysia. Was it that specific, or was this something that Verite identified and then co-developed this project with DOL?
So I think there's been a lot of noise about the sector. Certainly in the media, I recall many of the press reports, myself. There had been civil society reports prior to that also. I think most of those were largely, I think, accurate, but they were primarily qualitative in nature. And I think the feeling was, the gap perhaps to spur action was, a quantitative survey or study, that got at prevalence in some way, shape, or form. Now that, in a huge industry, that can be challenging and difficult. And so I think that was the catalyst. As for, the Department of Labor's interest, of course, it was certainly part of their mandate from U.S. Congress, because they annually publish, the list of goods produced with, with either forced or child labor. So this was on their radar screen. Frankly, the specifics of which came first, I don't recall myself. I was around at the time, but I don't specifically recall. But I know a proposal was put in to look at this sector, and for the first time too, we describe it as sort of operationalize the indicator approach and come up with a quantitative numbers that would frankly stand up to peer-reviewed sort of academic rigor and challenge, knowing also that it would have to be presented to governments, to the industry itself, and other stakeholders. That was the sort of the background to it.
Got it. Thank you. And then I'll just ask one more question and then open it up to the audience and the other panelists. Could you just provide an example of an organization that you worked with to translate those results into action? So, obviously, I think it was probably EICC at the time, and now Responsible Business Alliance. I don't know if that's an example that makes sense, or just another organization and how that collaboration was formed and how they used your research.
Yeah, obviously I can't speak for the Responsible Business Alliance, the EICC as it was at the time, but I think they've been fairly open about this, and it's a matter of sort of public record that I think the report was a wake-up call for them. At the time, as I recall, their standard allowed fees of up to the equivalent of 1 month to be charged. Some of their leading members had already moved to a zero fee requirement and had begun to a phased implementation, and as had other companies in other sectors. And I think in this instance, the report and perhaps some of the scrutiny it brought, perhaps some of the sort of the self-examination resulted in the organization deciding to move quickly. I believe it was an emergency meeting, and perhaps in early 2015, where they moved to to a zero fee standard, which has been in place since. I certainly don't wish to for Verite to claim credit for that. I'm sure this was an important consideration. I think, to be fair to the organization, it would have been certainly on their radar prior to that. But the companies we talk to and the organization, amongst others, still refer back to to that report as a kind of a watershed moment, perhaps.
Great. I see we've got some questions from the audience. So far, all the questions are from Winrock staff. So hopefully we get a little bit more diversity in there. But I'll just ask, I know we're not going to have time for all of these, but I'll just ask in order here. So Jean Crump is asking if there's a follow-up study planned, or if a follow-up study has been conducted to kind of see what the changes have been over time.
So there isn't a follow-up study that is designed, in the same way or has the exact same scope. We do have a research report coming out in the next couple of months, which looks at the issue of responsible recruitment in the electronic sector in Malaysia, and essentially obstacles to adoption. So, to my earlier comment, the Responsible Business Alliance changed their standards. There's been a lot of focus, there's been a lot of effort, and there's been progress in the intervening period. I don't think anybody's going to claim that the issue has been resolved. There are complex issues. There are obstacles that remain. So we have a report coming out in the next couple of months that will sort of highlight some of the progress that has been made, as well as some of the obstacles that remain, to be addressed. It's not going to quantify the prevalence in the same way as the 2014 report did, frankly, for a variety of different reasons. But they will, one will I suppose supplement the other, or provide context and a roadmap for certainly in our view what still needs to happen.
Okay. Great. Well, I think in the interest of time, I know there's some other questions that are waiting, and we should have some additional time at the end, but I think in the interest of time, we should move forward. And that means we're heading off to Max Butler from Verite, Crest Project Manager. And again, Crest is corporate responsibility in limiting slavery and trafficking. So go ahead, Max.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be presenting today on behalf of the IOM on this panel. For those who don't know the IOM, we are the UN Migration Agency operating around the world with all kinds of stakeholders, traditionally often with our member states, the governments and migrant communities, civil society, to create conditions of migration, often very challenging, but really create conditions for safe, regular, and humane migration that is to the benefit of all. And that's really at the core of the IOM constitution, the objectives of IOM, that migration is a positive force for development. It's recognized in the SDG agenda, but of course there are emergencies related to migration. There are adverse human rights conditions that migrants and migrant workers are facing all around the world, so there's still a lot to do. I personally, as Stephen mentioned, I'm the regional project manager of the CREST initiative of IOM. This is a fairly young work stream of IOM, where we really have put a bit more emphasis on working with the private sector and with business to basically bring them more into the equation of migration management, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. I was asked today by Stephen to basically turn this panel a little bit also into a conversation also with the other panelists. So I'll try to really pick up on Declan's presentation and try to sort of give a little bit in retrospect a history of how also we in IOM were able to take advantage of the Verite report from 2014 and really take the momentum that was created with stakeholders to go a bit deeper, including in partnership with Verite, to understand the vulnerabilities and situations of migrant workers in supply chains and various economic sectors. But just to confirm that the Verite piece of research in 2014 really was a good example of an effective piece of creating evidence. I think it was timed very well. It was some governments at that time probably working on the first generation of modern slavery laws and transparency in supply chain laws. It shined a spotlight on an industry, a consumer-based industry that is very concerned about their brand value and brand reputation. And suddenly there was an understanding and evidence really that some of these very important global and successful products may be associated with forced labor practices. So I think that was really a big wake-up call, not only for the electronics industries, but I do believe that other sectors, other industries, other leading companies really paid attention to that research at that time. Also very important, I think, was that this research, as Declan mentioned, was certainly not the first research of its kind. ILO, IOM, civil society organizations in other migration corridors, other geographies had already also profoundly researched this topic, but it was really, I think, effective in terms of showing that there's a systemic element to the exploitation of migrant workers in the industries, that certain exploitative practices being part of the recruitment or the employment are really sort of ingrained in these industries, and that it really takes a concerted effort to address those. And I also think the Responsible Business Alliance, or at that time the EICC, did take some decisive steps. Some of them were certainly already underway, but we keep looking back today, I think, to the electronics industry to try to understand good practices and learnings and bring them also to other industries. For IOM, I think, and for our work with the private sector in particular, this also opened a few doors really to engage in perhaps other sectors and a number of multinational companies to really dive a bit more deeply into the complex supply chains and the migration corridors, and really understand a bit more in detail the challenges, risks, and issues facing migrant workers throughout their journey. So at that time, Declan will remember 2015 then, we were approached by IKEA to really look into their company supply chain, to really have a focused research into their own supplier relations, into their own supply chain. Again, it was in Malaysia and countries of origin. We did partner with Verite to really come up with a methodology that perhaps was a little bit of an extension to what Verite had done in the electronics industries, and really look more closely and very close actually into the entire journey of the migrant workers and the experiences of the migrant workers, starting really from the recruitment process at their countries of origin. As we know, this starts at the village level or at the community level. Throughout the recruitment process, the processing and the departure and travel to the destination country, we know that for many migrant workers, it's the first time they might be leaving their country. So even the travel is a very new experience and is linked to risks and uncertainties for the workers. Then not only the work and the employment, also the life abroad, really looking also in the living conditions, perhaps the situation of migrant workers in the host societies, facing sometimes discrimination, marginalization, and so on. And also not forgetting the return of the migrant workers, right? This is also a very important topic. Contract-based temporary migrant workers will have no right to stay in the destination countries after the completion of their contract. So that means the employer and the recruiters also are responsible to also safeguarding the return of the migrant worker back to the country of origin, or even managing onward migration change of employers. So looking at that migration journey within a company supply chain, I think was really a bit of a breakthrough, or also created new momentum in the way how IOM understood the journeys of the migrant workers within the private sector. What was very important for us, and what perhaps connected with the IOM, with the work of the IOM that we had done already at that time, is really that focus also on the country of origin perspective. We know that recruitment, for one, causes a lot of the challenges during the labor migration process, but it also mostly takes place in the country of origin, right? By the time migrant workers arrive at the destination countries, recruitment is mostly done. So we really took this partnership with Verite and IKEA as an opportunity to go back and connect with the recruitment agencies. And through the networks with IOM, our relationships with the Recruitment Industry Association, but also the leverage that was coming from IKEA and the IKEA suppliers at that time, we were really able to connect with the recruitment agencies that were involved and associated in that supply chain, and understand quite a bit more about the the reality of these recruiters, about how would they run their business, and be able to answer in greater detail why is it that recruitment agencies have to charge migrant workers all of their fees and costs? Why do they have to operate the business model as such? And how do really the recruitment, the relationships between recruiters and employers look like? What is sort of the bargaining situation of recruiters in this relationship? Then also, because we did talk to the migrant workers in the workplaces in Malaysia, we already knew the recruitment fees and costs. So we were able to cross-reference almost these amounts of recruitment fees and costs with the recruitment agencies, and really arrived at a better understanding of what really is the true cost and the true amount of recruitment, and why is it often distorted to the disadvantage of the migrant workers. We went back also to the village level. We connected with the sub-agents and understood who are they, those sub-agents that everyone keeps talking about, and also understood that right on from the onset of recruitment, why is it really difficult for migrant workers to better negotiate the terms of their recruitment and employment. Another, I think, important aspect that came with this research methodology is that we were able to present it within the context of a company supply chain, and we could really much more clearly explain to also employers and recruiters how the processes or the policies and procedures that they mostly do not have in place, right? Employers often do not monitor the practices of the recruiters. They do not take part in the interview and selection process. They do not pay for the recruitment service. So there's a lot of absence of process and gaps in their systems. And we were now really able to show how these gaps cause very real, severe, and often systemic human rights risks for the migrant workers. So we had a powerful tool, I think, then for moving on with the companies. And last but not least, I think the granularity of these findings and learnings within the company supply chain certainly was a great partnership and collaboration with Verite and IKEA at that time. Also helped IOM teams in those countries to go back and speak to the policymakers, right? Because we were able to really catch up and understand the realities of the employers and recruiters and migrant workers to bring it back into the policy dialogue. And I think this was really, really helpful and continues to be helpful for the IOM until today.
Great, thanks, Max. And I want to connect something that Declan said earlier and your experience with IKEA. Obviously, one of the key issues, as Declan mentioned, is that the employers are not paying for the cost of recruitment, and there's two ways of doing that. One is for the employer to actually pay for the service, the recruitment service, from the outset, and the other is to refund the fees at the end of the process. I'm wondering, and again, this could be for Declan or Max or both, what you've seen companies do and what you think is most effective.
Well, I can start quickly and then back to Declan, certainly. But I mean, we do, I think, advocate quite strongly these days for companies, employers in particular, and with support of their buyers and brands to basically stop approaching this topic from a reimbursement perspective, because this means that migrant workers will have to pay in the first place. And we know it creates exactly the same issue as we had in the beginning. It creates a burdensome administrative process for everyone, because all the paperwork has to be established. Migrant workers suddenly have to carry receipts. It exposes them to potential overcharges that would not be accounted for. And it creates the possibility of incurring debt for the migrant worker to begin with. So we think while in the first years, perhaps, of implementing this employer pays policy or principle for recruitment, it was a success to reimburse migrant workers upon their arrival. I think it's time to more and more move towards an upfront payment, a proper sort of business relationship and service agreement between employers and recruiters to make sure that migrant workers do not pay any cost that they don't have to pay to begin with, including at the recruitment process in the countries of origin. There might be some exceptions when medical exams are required at an early stage, or there may be exceptions for passport and so on. But these are not, in all of our data, we've seen that these are not the major costs in the process. The real major costs are the service fees that go to pay the services and the placement of the recruitment agencies. And particularly this fee, we think, has to be paid directly by the employers. And another point, of course, that is very important, it's not only about paying upfront or reimbursing once workers arrive, but it's also important to carry out due diligence, right? And to make sure that there is less and less opportunity and less incentive really for recruitment agencies to charge migrant workers outside of the agreement, right? And the ILO, with the definition of recruitment fees and costs, defines very clearly that there is not only fees and costs that are regular or legitimate, there's also a whole bunch of illegitimate costs, right, that can be charged along the journey of the migrant workers. And it's really the responsibility of one of the regulators and the governments to better monitor this process, but recruitment fees are largely still legal, but also of the employers and the business partners to exercise this oversight and due diligence of the recruiters that overcharging won't happen anymore.
Yeah, just to add to that, Steve, I would agree wholeheartedly with what Max says. Employers should, wherever possible, pay all of the fees and costs directly. Really, the only exceptions should be those where it's simply not practicable or where it's required by law that they be paid by the workers. These tend to be de minimis type charges, airport departure taxes and so on, and they should be reimbursed quickly thereafter. Reimbursement is a remedy. Reimbursement should not be considered to be compliance. If we don't get away from that, we'll never be finished dealing with these issues, because the opportunity to have migrant workers pay and reimburse will be exploited by unscrupulous agents and others, and workers will be prevailed upon, will be threatened, or will be otherwise coerced into not disclosing what they paid, and the cycle will continue. So irrespective of what the law is, unless it's required that the workers pay these fees, the employer should pay all of these directly or to the agent in every case. And as Max points out, those relationships need to be bona fide, commercially sound, ethical, and legal arrangements like any other commercial arrangement.
Great, thank you, Max, and thank you, Declan. I want to make sure we leave sufficient time for CBeatry, but I do want to add in one more audience question here as long as we're waiting. It's a big question though, so Max, maybe just a response from you and like one example maybe, rather than trying to answer this entire question. But Jesse, hi, Jesse Fisher from Elevate. The question is, how is COVID impacting the vulnerability of migrant workers? What key points should companies be aware of to ensure they're engaging their suppliers to reduce the vulnerability of migrant workers and further support their responsible recruitment commitment? So again, Max, maybe just one example of something that you're seeing as a major risk and a potential way of addressing that risk.
Yeah, thanks Jesse for the question. It's a very important one, but a very difficult one. Of course, the pandemic, the health crisis, and then the economic situation after that quickly revealed that migrant workers remain among the most vulnerable. And in a situation of crisis, we also knew that from natural disasters and earthquakes before, are very quick to deprive migrant workers from the limited protections they have to begin with. So if a system of labor migration, of employment of migrant workers is sort of abusive and discriminatory to begin with, in a crisis, and COVID-19 exemplified that, that becomes worse very quickly. I will perhaps refer and give one example that our partners from civil society keep highlighting in this regard. While, of course, we were concerned about the situation of migrant workers in overcrowded dormitories or during mobility, during migrating in a times of pandemic, which all exposed them to higher risk. And we know in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, that there were outbreaks indeed, and also in the Middle East in dormitories. One of the key issues that civil society is flagging is the issue of wage theft, or the non-payment of outstanding wages and benefit in a time of retrenchment, right? Because companies and employers were downsizing relatively quickly in specific industries more than others during the pandemic. Migrant workers were often the first to let go, and then it was possibly quite convenient for workers to ensure the return. Maybe migrant workers, we know that often migrant workers had to pay for the return themselves and were not paid their outstanding wages and benefits. And then being back home in the community of origin, of course, barriers being very high for migrant workers to claim and access remedy against some of these violations is really a key issue that we've been seeing.
Great, thank you, Max. And our last presenter today, CBeatry Restrepo, Senior Manager, Worker Engagement and Programs at Elevate. Go ahead, CBeatry.
Great, thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening. I'm CBeatry, and I'm very delighted to be participating in today's panel on behalf of Elevate. Very glad to see how many people has joined today. And really looking forward to continuing the conversation. I'm going to be sharing a few slides, so I'm going to try to pull that up. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
I can see it.
Great. So today we'll be, just talking about how companies can identify and address forced labor, specifically bonded labor, as it relates to recruitment costs. And I think that so Max and Declan have already really fleshed out in a little bit of detail sort of these commitments from companies and sort of the evolution of where we are today. So I'm going to try to provide a little bit more of hands-on experience of what we've been doing in the ground with some of these companies. But before I begin, just a quick introduction about Elevate. And you guys probably already know about Elevate, but we're an independent business risk and sustainability professional services with a global reach. So our global footprint covers over 100 countries. And we also have very specific local field-based expertise. And we deliver a wide range of services to our clients, including assessment and audits, as well as consulting at a corporate level, but also at a factory or farm level, as well as program management and analytics to really help our clients manage their risk and improve their supply chain performance. Specific to Southeast Asia, which has been a focus on today's conversation, and we will continue to focus on this region. We have more than 10 years of experience focusing on foreign migrant worker related issues, in particular forced labor and recruitment. And our work is extensive regarding to worker surveys and audits, training to factories, as well as verification of labor agents, as well as broader multi-stakeholder engagement projects that include, for example, setting up a countrywide helpline or grievance mechanism for workers in Malaysia. So a little bit of context, and again, I think this is just more like a refresher, and it has already been brought up in conversation today. There's a lot of events really that prompt due diligence and has brought us to where we are today, and the reason why we're having this conversation. And the whole regulation regarding forced labor it dates back to 1930 with the U.S. Tariff Act, which prohibited the importation of goods made by forced labor, including child labor, into the U.S. But of course, this regulation wasn't enforced for many, many years until 5 years ago in 2015 under the Obama administration. And in parallel to the U.S. legislation, we've also seen increased legislation, since the UK passed their Modern Slavery Act in 2015, and then France followed with their duty of vigilance law 2 years later. And there's even been recent conversations here in Hong Kong about implementing something similar. And of course, we have Australia's parliament joining the movement with the establishment of their Modern Slavery Act. But really, I think what the key turning point was last year in 2019, when there was a boom in the withhold release orders against a number of companies across different sectors. So of course, we see the apparel, the gloves manufacturing, palm oil, all being sort of held accountable by the strength and capabilities of the US Custom and Border Protection. And in addition to all this increased regulation and intention of forced labor, which began 2018, 2019, we also see increased reputational risk and demand for transparency in supply chain. So, you can see from the photos on the right-hand side, there's a lot of concerns being raised by advocacy groups and very well-known organizations around the world, including Transparentum and Liberty Shared and other NGOs in the space of recruitment and worker rights. And so all of these major forces basically come together to influence and fundamentally change the way that companies deal with forced labor risks, as well as their willingness and urgency to take action. So what we're seeing on the ground basically is companies moving towards remedy. And what this means really is repaying thousands, if not millions of workers who've been asked to pay recruitment fees to secure their jobs in Malaysia and Thailand or elsewhere. And an example of an early mover and pioneer in terms of quote unquote remediation is Apple, who was committed to reimbursing over 28 million US dollars to over 34,000 workers in their supply chains back in 2009. And then fast forward today, we see more and more companies really being held accountable to repaying workers, not only for fees, and this is something that Max brought up earlier, not only for fees that they've paid to recruitment agents in source countries, but also to basically paying loans that they were gradually paying back to their employers through paycheck deductions. And so currently, Elevate, with all this momentum, we've been really on the ground helping a number of companies, especially in Malaysia, who have agreed to these holistic remediation programs, including substantial financial payments to workers. And these holistic remediation programs not only include the implementation of a zero-cost policy, but also the actual reimbursement of fees via standard calculation methods. Some of these methods and protocols involve determining the eligibility of workers, basically who should be in scope, what should be the fees amounts paid by nationality, what should be the payment terms and schedules and protocols. And there's a lot of details that we could get into if relevant in today's discussion. And in addition to that, we've seen really the burden of proof shifted completely to the employer, and workers not being asked to submit receipts and anymore for fear of retaliation or coercive action. So and then finally, of course, the importance of verifying and validating via external organizations that workers are indeed getting reimbursed amounts as they were promised in full. So all of this really all of these remediation programs are good, but I agree with Max and Declan, they're not enough, and they're definitely reactive. They're trying to fix the problem rather than actually proactively preventing these issues from happening in the first place. So we encourage really at Elevate companies and our clients to take a more holistic, programmatic approach that covers the entire worker journey from pre-departure, even pre-decision, all the way to employment. And to achieve this, there's a number of tools and solutions that can be used in combination, really for companies to have greater visibility about their potential risks. And these include, I'm just going to highlight the first three. First one being risk landscaping through audit add-ons that focus specifically on foreign migrant worker related risks. So these are really designed for countries like Taiwan, Malaysia, Thailand, Jordan, Italy, and all of these high-risk countries that we already know, right, that use a high proportion of foreign migrant workers. Second, we also use worker surveys focused on forced labor and recruitment, which is mapped against the ILO's indicators. And really, this allows companies to deploy via mobile technology surveys that are anonymous to really collect reliable data and feedback from workers directly in real time. And finally, open lines of communication. So again, super important to have grievance mechanisms and helplines available to workers, both foreign and domestic, for them to really raise questions, concerns about not only the remediation program, because workers will have questions about how is this being made, what's the purpose, when are they getting amounts, right? And all of these things of the process, which can be a little bit confusing, but also for, we've seen through our helplines in Malaysia and Bangladesh that there's been a spike in calls from workers in the past year due to COVID regarding not only to immediate health and safety risk concerns, but also longer term questions about economic vulnerability, job security, deportation, you know, in Malaysia, things about restriction and all of these risks that have been exacerbated really during the times of COVID. So to conclude with these remarks and hoping to move on to a discussion, there's already a lot out there in terms of valuable insights, you know, provided by organizations like Verite and IOM in terms of what are the best practices and guidelines that companies should adopt to address forced labor in their supply chains. So really our goal now, in my view, should be to help these companies decode some of these principles to be able to move forward in a way that all of these programs can be adopted and can be really operationalized for local actors, not just a few, but really across the industries. So both in terms of detecting risk, but also in terms of verifying and supporting any verification and remediation that needs to take place. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Steve to facilitate the discussion.
Great, thank you, CBeatry. Yeah, it was useful to have Elevate, I think, come in at the end there, because obviously Elevate's primary business is working directly with companies on solutions. And what you presented obviously seems quite comprehensive, although still challenging, I think, for many companies to implement. One of the questions that comes up for me, and it's kind of related to what we were just discussing earlier, is you know, you talked a lot about fee reimbursement and some of the challenges of that, but how you try to establish what the norm should be from an origin country. This also relates to a question that has come up in the chat from Kevin Hong, talking about the issues related to workers being able to recall all of their expenses, to potentially over-report in some cases or under-report in other cases, and then you know, trying to cross-reference that with agencies and recruiters and what's expected from particular countries of origin. So I'm wondering, you know, how you expect companies to handle a case where a worker potentially reports something, an expense that's significantly higher than what would be expected from an origin country. Since you were talking about the burden, you know, the burden of proof is no longer on the worker. So how's that managed? And also, can that be used as an incentive for what Verite and IOM, Max and Declan talked about in terms of, you know, getting employers to pay for the cost of recruitment up front rather than trying to rely on this complex system of trying to estimate what those fees could be?
Yeah, that's a great question and a difficult one that actually our clients are still trying to figure it out as they put together these remediation programs. I think in terms of standard methodology for coming up with the fees amounts that should be reimbursed by nationality, there's a number of steps that we've seen being used in and adopted in the industry, also building off what was done in the electronic sector a couple of years ago. And that is trying to do in-person interviews with workers to try to figure it out. What are these, fees that they've paid to their recruitment agents in source countries, or any loans, right, that were deducted by employers or any other actors in the way. But of course, we've seen that when interviews are conducted, there's a lot of different fees and that are reported with workers. So our recommendation really is for companies to look at that whole range of reported fees from workers and try to figure it out what's the average by nationality. Oftentimes, and this is, obviously this depends on the situation, we might recommend using a median, because try to avoid those, as you mentioned, Steve, like outliers, very low or very high from a few workers who may have had a very specific situation. Once, this average or this understanding of what's, the benchmark per nationality, it's always important to still compare that to industry standards. So there's some information, again, by the ILO, by IOM, but as well as RBA's own database. Elevate, we've had work in Malaysia for the past 10 years. So we've also sort of have our own information in terms of what workers usually pay. But then again, it's always very tricky and a complex method, a complex calculation. I do think that in terms of using this as an incentive for employers to pay upfront, definitely. I think that there's already been enough case studies and a lot of other companies with withhold release orders that have had to pay so much more. So the financial cost of not acting and not, preventing these recruitment fees from being charged early on, it's so much worse than actually, for example, investing more in audits or investing more in all of these stronger due diligence processes during the pre-departure and recruitment. So I think we've definitely seen that. And specifically to Malaysia, I think there's been a change in mindset from factory managers, factory owners, in terms of what's expected from them in moving forward. And I think they're a lot more willing now to sort of invite and let external organizations come into their workplaces and try to help them out, ways to promote, ethical recruitment and better practices.
Great, thank you. Thank you, CBeatry. There was a question earlier from Vali from our Winrock Cambodia team, and now CTIP Asia. And he was asking about a complex situation in Cambodia, which is common across many countries. And specifically, he was talking about the brick kiln industry in Cambodia that is highly tied to the government. And I think in other situations, we also see sectors that are highly tied to recruiting, or governments that are highly tied to recruiting agencies. And so, Max, I think this is probably a good question for you. And how do we, when there's kind of this entrenched system and there really isn't an incentive to break, to change, there isn't an incentive to move to a new system because the government is tied to the recruiting agency and the government is tied to the employers, and no one wants to change because they're all making money off of the system. How do you kind of break through in a situation like that?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most difficult questions to answer altogether in that context. When situations of pervasive corruption, which we all know happens, lack of enforcement of laws to begin with, or even political dimensions come into that forced labor agenda, it becomes even more complex. I think, I need to bring it back a bit more to the topic of labor migration rather than the situation in Cambodia, which I'm not too familiar with. And while there are possibly a few avenues to improve the situation. One that I'm quite hopeful about in the context of migration is that it's a regional or even a global system of labor mobility, right? And we know that it's also a market where countries, really countries of origin in particular, compete for access to these overseas job markets. Now, it depends then on a little bit on the parameters of the market. If the market is in a situation of a race to the bottom, and if it's about providing labor in the cheapest and fastest way possible, then of course we have a negative market, and we see sort of also corruption perhaps becoming more pervasive and prevalent even across border. But the moment, and we know that anecdotally from some of the companies we have worked with, the moment employers, for example, are accountable for the recruitment process and are in a situation where they have or want to pay for the recruitment services, they will be looking back to the recruitment agencies in the countries of origin and suddenly be comparing those that are more transparent and that are more cost effective, right? So adding then fees for bribery, let's say, becomes a business risk for recruitment agencies. And we do see that this has been happening initially for some companies, that their suppliers are going back and, for example, go to the Philippines, where they have the feeling that recruitment is more transparent and the costs are clearer and a bit more cost effective as compared to other countries. And another point that I do see, and I feel a bit encouraged even in 2020 about regulatory developments, we do see a number of countries improving their regulations on labor migration. We've heard last week Saudi Arabia, Qatar earlier this year, abolishing or moving towards abolishing the kafala system. We even had Indonesia as one of the first countries of origin now to moving to repeal worker paid recruitment fees from most of the sectors, we understand. So I think these are also very positive regulatory developments that need to happen.
That's great, Max. I mean, that's super encouraging to hear. There's maybe a little bit of a race to the top, and the encouragement of competition among countries. That's a great point. Unfortunately, I think we have to wrap up. I know there are a couple other questions in the chat box, but again, appreciate your time, each of the panelists, and for all the attendees. I think we were sitting above 100 for most of the sessions, so that's great to see. Thank you, Declan. Thank you, Max, and thank you, CBeatry. I think we'll end it there. And again, thanks for your time, and looking forward to the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session. Please do join us at the other sessions in the summit. In fact, we have a technology panel happening right now in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and paste the link into the chat right now. You can also find this on your participants guide that has been sent to you, or in a calendar invite that has been sent to you. The next session will be leveraging technology and private sector initiatives, innovative solutions, practices, and research methodologies. Please continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams, especially if you're interested in finding collaborators for the pitch competition being offered through participation in the Evidence to Action Summit. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and have a wonderful day.